Well, welcome to our third week of devotions on spiritual formation and leadership. And in this particular lesson, I want to talk about the ability and the potential that we have as leaders and how that can determine the effectiveness of an organization, how that can determine the effectiveness of a church or a ministry. And in his book, The 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership, John Maxwell talks about, in the first law, he talks about is the law of the lid. And I remember reading this about 20 years ago when I first began in pastoral ministry, and it had a big impact on me. And in the book, Maxwell describes that as leaders, we have lids. We have certain abilities. And however high that ability is, it's going to determine in many parts the effectiveness, the results of what happens in our ministry areas. Obviously, the assumption here that John's making is that the Holy Spirit is working in and through us and is also working in and through a ministry context or a church. However, we also have a role to play. It's not just up to God, and we don't have to do a thing about it. It's a partnership when it comes to leadership. Very much, as I mentioned in a previous devotional, is that we're collaborating with God. We're joining God in His work, and we have a role to play. And as leaders, as we look in the mirror and look at the kind of abilities that we have as leaders, it's very important to take a look and to always try to improve, to always try to refine certain areas. And of course, we're going to have weaknesses, and we probably won't be able to improve too much of those. But when it comes to key areas of leadership that we do need to have the capacity in order to lead effectively, then we need to pay attention to that. So, for example, when I first began as a pastor of student ministries, I was working at a church in Chanhassen, and the ministry I was overseeing was relatively small. It was about 35 students, grades 7 through 9. And I remember the pastor at that time, who is still to this day a mentor and a friend, he told me about the importance of communication, that my communication ability and my ability to teach and give vision to our students and volunteers would determine a lot of what's going to happen in my ministry. And if I were to rate my ability in the area of communication and teaching, at that time I would have rated it probably around maybe a 4 or 5. And I needed to raise that lid, that capacity, that ability, in order to really make a difference. So as a result, I spent a week at a communication conference in Colorado, led by well-known author and comedian Ken Davis. And it absolutely transformed my communication ability. And a couple years after that, I really saw some big differences in my teaching of the students, in my preaching ability, in my ability to communicate vision, for example. And at that time, I would have rated my communication ability probably more like around a 7. And as a result, in addition to other variables, I don't want to say that was the only one, but our student ministry grew. And it grew from about 35 to 40 students up to about 150. And my teaching and communication ability was a very important part of that. And I had the spiritual gift of teaching, but it needed to be developed more. It needed to be improved. And that conference in Colorado really made a difference, in addition to a lot of work I put in around that as well. And for you and in your leadership, you need to look at some of the key areas of your leadership and ask yourself the question, when it comes to communication, when it comes to conflict resolution, when it comes to interpersonal skills, where would you rate yourself? Where does your lid rest? Is it a 4? Is it a 5? If you were to rank it from 0 to 10, kind of rate yourself in some of those key areas. And I would encourage you to do that during the course of this class. And then if you feel like maybe it's conflict resolution, if you feel like it's low and it needs to be raised up, then you need to take steps. God has given you the responsibility as a leader to improve. So, for example, if it's conflict resolution, maybe it's teaming up with a counselor or perhaps a trusted friend that can help you learn some keys when it comes to conflict resolution. Because as we all know, when it comes to leadership, you're always going to deal with conflict. You're always going to deal with people who have complaints and who have problems. And many times as a leader in ministry, we're very much like firemen. We're putting out fires. And a big part of that is conflict resolution. But we need to pay attention as leaders to this, what John Maxwell calls the law of the lid. Is that wherever our lid is in key areas of ministry, it's going to determine the effectiveness of the ministry or the church that we're leading. Because our church or our ministry is never going to outgrow our leadership ability. So, for example, if your conflict resolution is at a 4 or 5, your ministry context or your church is really never going to grow in terms of dealing with conflict beyond your capacity as a leader. That's so important for us to pay attention to that. And we see that in the scriptures. We see that in the example in the book of Acts when Apollos is not confronted, but he's actually he's talked to by Priscilla and Aquila, this husband and wife team in the book of Acts that God uses in amazing ways. But in Acts chapter 18, we pick it up in verse 24. Priscilla and Aquila are in the audience, and they hear Apollos teaching. And they notice that Apollos needs some help. He needs some advice. Verse 24 of Acts chapter 18. Now there came to Ephesus a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria. He was an eloquent man. So right there, Luke, who's writing the book of Acts, tells us he's got gifts in communication. He's eloquent. An eloquent man, well-versed in the scriptures. In other words, he knows his Bible. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord. He spoke with burning enthusiasm and taught accurately the things concerning Jesus, though he knew only the baptism of John. So, again, Luke notes, not only does he have eloquence, not only does he have giftedness, that he knows the Bible, but also he has passion. I like that Luke notes that for us. It's not like Apollos has no teaching abilities. He has a lot of capacity here, but there's some areas he's missing. And it's the fact that he's missing the full story of Jesus Christ. Luke notes that Apollos was taught mainly around the baptism of John. So there's an aspect to his theology, his teaching, that he's missing. So it says here, in verse 26, he began to speak boldly in the synagogue. But when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained the way of God to him more accurately. And then verse 27, I love this, is that on Apollos' arrival to the city that he was going to, he greatly helped those who through grace had become believers, for he powerfully refuted the Jews in public, showing by the scriptures that the Messiah is Jesus. So Priscilla and Aquila were able to help Apollos really refine his theology, to develop his teaching, that the good news was really about Jesus Christ, the Messiah, not just the baptism of John. And that's an important lesson for us, is that we see Priscilla and Aquila come alongside Apollos and, in a sense, raise his lid. They raise his capacity for teaching. And I'm not sure what number you'd put it on, but as a result of what Priscilla and Aquila do, is that Apollos is more effective in reaching unbelievers for Jesus Christ. And without their help, Apollos' lid for teaching would have remained very low, and it would have been very limited. But because of them coming alongside him, they were able to raise up his teaching so that it had a more comprehensive and more fullness when it came to the gospel. And that's important for us. And it's something that, as leaders, we need to be paying attention to. Because as leaders, we're also learners. And we need to learn certain areas of our leadership that need to be improved in order that God can continue to do the great work in our ministry areas, in our churches. So for you, I want to encourage you. Think about key areas, and it may come up in the 4R model as we talk about roles and responsibilities. Maybe it's strategy formulation. Maybe it's vision casting. Maybe there's some areas where you're not as strong, but you need to be because you've been called as a leader and perhaps as a pastor. And if you're lacking in those areas, not only to pray about it, that's very important, is to pray about it. I had a friend who once told me, before we do anything, we must pray. But we also must do more than just pray. So there's that, before we do anything, we must pray, but also we must do more than just pray. In other words, we need to take the steps. We need to give effort in addition to our prayerful dependence upon the Holy Spirit. So perhaps for you, it's identifying certain roles or responsibilities that you have as a leader. And maybe it's finding a Priscilla and Aquila and having them help you raise the lid. Maybe it's attending a conference. Maybe it's getting together with a business leader in your church and to ask him or her for their advice when it comes to finances. Because one of the main responsibilities that we're going to have as leaders revolves around budgets. And a good friend of mine heard a leader in his church who's on staff just remark and say, you know what, I'm really bad at budgets and I'm just not very good financially, and that's just the way it is. That's a really poor response. Because although some of us are not as gifted financially, there are certain things that we can learn to improve ourselves with budgets, because that's going to be a big part of our leadership, is how we handle a budget, especially in a church, especially in a ministry where resources are so scarce. A nonprofit organization requires some sort of acumen when it comes to finances. So maybe it's tapping into a business leader who really can mentor you and help you when it comes to budgets, how to plan them properly, how to manage a budget. So my prayer for you is, as you look in the mirror of your leadership, is to be honest. And maybe it's identifying one or two areas of your leadership right now where the lid is a little bit lower. And you know it needs to be higher for effectiveness to occur in your ministry. And through the work of the Holy Spirit and depending upon Him, and also through your own efforts, and maybe reaching out, maybe tapping into certain resources, that you can raise that lid higher. And as a result, more glory will go to God's name. Thank you.